In this video, I wanted to show how to utilize the attack actions in the Roll20 character sheet. In our game, there's been some challenges in how the attacks are being rolled and where the data should go. And I wanted to show a couple different options here. So some of this is directed at the players in the game I'm participating in. Some of this is general knowledge. One of the first things that happens in our game is we say edit the cog wheel. This is what we mean. Almost every single field has a cog wheel that allows you to click on it and edit it and take you out of edit mode. You can see when you're not in edit mode, it's much cleaner. It makes it a little bit easier to see. So use the cog wheels to edit. This applies to attacks as well as all your features and traits down here. This is how you can edit and make changes in there. So that's just a heads up. That comes up a lot. We say that a lot in our game. Edit the settings. Like these are the sheet settings, for example. And players don't really understand what that cog wheel means. They're on almost everything in the game. So let's look at attacks. One of the things that happens is oftentimes people use the compendium and they simply drag and drop a weapon onto their inventory down here, and that adds an attack for them, and they think that's all they really need to do. And for the most part, this works for a single attack. In this case, this longsword is rolling 1d8 plus my strength bonus in here for damage. However, there's some challenges with that. The longsword is a versatile weapon, which means you can use it two-handed. So we had a player, for example, who was doing the additional damage here, and all he did was simply just put in 1d10 damage. This creates a challenge, and it doesn't really convey what that number is. Why are we getting an additional number over here? Not completely certain why. So what I want to do is I want to look at some better ways of doing this. When you have weapons that have vastly different weapon profiles, specifically the damage that's done at them, this second damage characteristic isn't really the ideal place. This is more for things like, let's say you have a flaming weapon here. In this case, this is a great place to put the fire damage from a flaming weapon. So you can see here that when I click on this, every time I roll, it does the fire damage in accordance with that weapon. That's really more for an additional attribute of that weapon. So how do we handle the single-handed and two-handed? Well, the easiest way is to simply rename this weapon and create an additional one. So we're just going to create an additional weapon, and we'll call this two-handed in this case. The attack is based off of strength. We are proficient. The crit range is the normal, and in this case, the damage is 1d10 instead of 1d8. And we'll also put in the damage type slashing. Now, if this is the same sword and also has the flaming effect on it, we can add that additional damage type here. Now, this can be confusing sometimes up in here, so one of the things you can do is drag these down to the macro bar down here. The great thing about doing this is these buttons are always linked to these attacks, and that'll come into play in a minute. If what you want to do is simply rename these, simply right click and we'll say one-handed longsword in this case, and then we'll do a two-handed longsword. So now these buttons are down here. We can click on them, and you can see that when I do that, oops, I clicked it twice, it rolled appropriately here, even when I crit. It did the double damage here, and here I rolled it again, but you can do a two-handed strike as well. And you can see that now it's rolling 1d10. It's very clear in the chat what's happening here. You're doing a one-handed attack or a two-handed attack. It makes it very, very easy to understand. So now let's take a look at some other characteristics. Now you want to add the raging effect. In this case, we are dealing with a barbarian. Well, raging is not on all the time. So initially you might think, well, I'll add it to the damage here. Well, unfortunately, that means that every single time you roll, even when you're not raging, you'll be rolling that additional damage, and it's not very clear, you can see here, where it's coming from. There's a better way to handle this. So let's take that +2 away. Now that is a way you can do it. If you're going to be raging every time, or say you have dueling as a fighter and you're always going to be using it, that is something you can do. But there's a better feature in the new character sheets found here, and that's something called a global damage modifier. If you go to your settings in the upper right hand corner, you can enable this field. It's off by default. This adds a new field here, which is checked, and by default they use sneak attack as an example to understand how it works. But in this case, we're going to be using rage. Now, you'll notice here that we've done 2 and then in brackets behind it listed rage damage. We're also going to type rage damage here as well. This is the label that will appear underneath it, while this is the information that appears in brackets behind it, such as strength or mod or whatever that might be. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that, and now we can turn rage on and off as needed. So when we're raging and we do a two-handed longsword attack, we crit, and I am showing a bug here. This bug has been submitted to Roll20. Rage is actually not doubled, only rolls are doubled. So you would have to subtract 2 from this roll right here. But you can see with this crit, we did a phenomenal amount of damage. We did 5, we rolled here an extra d10, and then our fire damage was rolled twice because they were dice that were rolled as part of the attack. So you can see, and then I can turn rage off. And in this case we missed regardless, but you can see that the rage damage goes away. Notice because we labeled it rage damage, it appears underneath it. And then when we hover over it in brackets, it clarifies what that is. Now, why is that advantageous? Well, sometimes you might have multiples of these. Let's say you took a level in fighter and you have the dueling characteristic, which is only available when you're one-handed fighting. We're going to list it in brackets and we're going to list it down here as well. So now, with both of these turned on, we'll take a one-handed longsword attack in which we benefit from it. And you can see here that we have rage damage and we're dueling. And when we hover over this, we can see that both of those bonuses have been applied. This doesn't affect the initial dice roll for the attack or the fire damage. Now let's talk about critical strikes a little bit. We're dealing with a half-orc. They have something called Savage Attacks where they gain an additional weapon's damage dice to the attack one additional time when they crit. Barbarians also get this feature later on as well. So this is important to know. Under the editing abilities for the weapon, you have something here that lists the critical damage. Now it's important to note this is an override from the actual damage that's calculated automatically. So by default, it doubles the dice rolled. Now in this case, we add an additional dice. So what we're going to do is we're not going to add just an additional d8. We need to recalculate the entire critical strike damage. So in this case, instead of rolling 1 additional d8, we will roll 2 additional d8s to the we will add to the damage. And to make this very apparent, we'll lower the critical threshold here to see how this works. So now, when we do our one-handed longsword attack, we have rage and dueling enabled. Now keep in mind this number will be wrong when we crit. Here we can see that we got our rage and our dueling. This number is wrong. Notice in fact, it's only calculating the very first one here. This is a bug that's been submitted. But notice what's happened here. The critical strike damage for the weapon attack is rolling 2d8 instead of an additional d8. Where the fire just rolled really well. So in this case, you can see with a fire weapon, raging and dueling, we did a massive amount of damage on the critical strike. So hopefully that's helpful, helps you understand how to customize your weapon attacks, make them extremely readable so that your DM and other players aren't always asking, where's that damage coming from? Because that's oftentimes confusing where damage sources are coming from. Another way to do this is to always just include an additional attack that just doesn't even roll damage. So let's take this fire damage, for example. We could actually just take the attack off and say 2d6. We will add no bonus, and this will just be fire damage. I do this for my sneak attack. Actually, let's make this sneak attack. Let's say we took a level of rogue, and we get 1d6 sneak attack, and I'm not going to put the type in here. Well, we will. Sneak attack. So this is something where you don't always have to determine whether or not you're going to be taking your sneak attack before you make the attack roll. So I make my one-handed longsword attack, which obviously missed here. But let's say we hit. We have our rage and our dueling damage, our slashing and our fire. And I say, you know what? I want to use my sneak attack right now. I can click it. and I can add an additional 4. Unfortunately, that doing this that way will add the rage and the dueling to it, so you'd have to ignore that. So there's a few things there to kind of like work out how that will appear. But this is another option. You can always just do it this way. So for example, you could actually turn these off, and you could just have these as well. Rage, damage. So this is another way of doing this. Disable this. So there's rage, damage. Now this gets a little complicated because then you've got to click all these individual buttons while you're going through here. But this is another way you could do it. You make your longsword attack, it does the slashing and the firing damage, and I say, yes, I was raging, I was dueling, and I was doing a sneak attack all at the same time. And you can see that those numbers are added as well. So that's another way you could do that. Though I really like the damage modifiers. I think they're going to be really powerful with their latest addition to the character sheet.